Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We have a great show for you today. My friend Joe Scarborough. He's a New York Times bestselling author, a Washington Post columnist, the creator of Morning Joe, a former U.S. congressman, and the author of a great new book, Saving Freedom, Truman, the Cold War, and the Fight for Western Civilization. Joe Scarborough, welcome to the news.
Thank you so much, Matt. I greatly appreciate it. It's great talking to you again.
It is great to talk with you, and we'll kind of bounce around here, but I want to start off by, in the beginning of your book, you talk about how in your congressional office, you had a picture of Ronald Reagan and a picture of Harry Truman, and some people thought that was weird, but in some ways it makes perfect sense. Talk about that.
Well, in the Scarborough household, we were all conservatives, and in the Scarborough household, being a conservative started with being a Cold Warrior. And so while I was known as being, let's just say, one of the more extreme members of the 1994 class when it came to small budgets and balancing the budget and pushing leadership, I was a Cold Warrior first. And the Cold War had just ended 3 years earlier when the Soviet Union ceased to exist on Christmas Day, 1991. So in my office, I had two pictures. I had a picture of the president who started the Cold War. I had a picture of the president who ended the Cold War, along with George H.W. Bush. And that was Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan. When people came into the office, they understood why a guy like me would have Reagan on the wall, but they didn't understand Harry Truman. And so I would just say, well, that's the guy that started the Cold War, and that guy over there is the guy who ended the Cold War. And usually when you say something like that, there seems to be more value to the guy who ended a war, ended a fight. But in this case, Harry Truman, while Ronald Reagan certainly had to stare down a lot of political enemies to do what he did to bring the Cold War to a position where he and George H.W. Bush could end it. Harry Truman had so many obstacles in actually starting the Cold War because the United States had just finished World War II, of course. The nation was exhausted. We had a 150-year history of being isolationists in peacetime. Obviously, if we're provoked into war like we were in World War I and World War II, we would go to war. But then, just like we did after World War I, we would retreat back to Fortress America because we had followed George Washington's advice. It was in the first inaugural, or it was in his farewell address to the nation, where George Washington told Americans as he was leaving the White House to avoid foreign entanglements. And that was such an important ruling philosophy that Washington's farewell address has actually been read on the Senate floor every year since 1862. And so the Senate was sort of the bastion of isolationism. And so after World War II ended, Americans wanted to come home. They wanted to let Europe worry about Europe. And unfortunately, Harry Truman wasn't given that luxury. The British let us know in early 1947 that they could no longer defend Greece. They could no longer defend Turkey. They could no longer stand shoulder to shoulder with us, that they were an exhausted country, an exhausted empire. And if we wanted to stop Joseph Stalin and Soviet communism from spreading into Central and Western Europe, it was going to be the United States basically doing it alone. And so Truman, faced with that challenge, he had to get to work on it, and get to work on it he did.
Yeah. And I'm a huge Reagan fan, as you know, but it's probably more popular to try to end a war than to start one, especially if you've just been involved in like a 5-year
Right.
world war. So for Truman he had a lot of challenges here, right? He had to he had to kind of marshal support and lay the predicate for doing this. He had to, create the framework or the worldview, the language for what this would look like. And then he had to get buy-in and sell it. And that's a huge undertaking for like a failed haberdasher who was called the Second Missouri Compromise and who left office with like really low approval ratings. I think that's part of the reason that this book is so needed, is to call attention to that accomplishment.
Well, he really he had an extraordinary life. As you said, he was a failed haberdasher. His father had been a failed businessman. He went off to World War I, and he came back and wanted to marry Bess, and Bess's mother tried to stop the marriage. He when he ran for Senate in 1934. He only was allowed to do so after the first four people that the party machine in Kansas City wanted to run refused to run because they didn't think they could win. Truman ran. He won in 34. He ran for re-election in 40. FDR wouldn't even endorse him. And he was once again expected to lose badly. He won in 1940. In 1944, there was a split in the party. And Henry Wallace, of course, was not only a left-wing progressive, he also was sympathetic to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union and the Soviet cause. And so FDR realized that he needed to get Wallace off the ticket. And so they were trying to figure out who was going to be FDR's running mate in 44. And at one point, FDR's chief of staff, when the name Truman came up, yelled, "Who the hell is Harry Truman?" and afterwards, the media asked another person inside the room where it happened, why Truman? And the guy said, "You know what? We were just tired." He was the second Missouri Compromise. So after Selected, Time magazine called him the mousy little man from Missouri. The New York Times dismissed him as a rube, but he became president. FDR knew he was going to die. In fact, he told Truman during the 44 campaign, he said, "Hey, listen, don't fly on planes. One of us has to stay alive." And Truman also understood that FDR was dying. Despite that fact, he only met with FDR 2 times while they were in the White House together. And he didn't find out about the atomic bomb, didn't find out about the Manhattan Project until after his first cabinet meeting as president. So Truman had to make some extraordinary choices on how to win the war in Europe, how to win the war in the Pacific, and then how to build support to stand up to Joseph Stalin, to stand up to Soviet totalitarianism. The United States had already failed miserably at Yalta, and the summit basically gave Stalin Eastern Europe, and he had designs on Central and Western Europe after the war because Stalin knew that the British Empire was exhausted, and the British were exhausted, and I'm sure he thought we were going to be isolationists. So Harry Truman had to put together this coalition while he was being fought, not just by isolationist Republicans, but by progressive Democrats in his own party who were far too ambivalent toward the threat that the Soviet Union posed. But he did it. And Truman did it for the same reason I am hopeful that Joe Biden is going to be able to forge compromise with the Republican Senate. And that's because they are, like Truman, like Biden, are creatures of the Senate. Truman had been around for a decade. He knew all the players. He knew Arthur Vandenberg, who was an isolationist from Michigan and was also the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the United States Senate. And he began working with Vandenberg hand in hand, step by step, shoulder to shoulder, however you want to put it. And not only did he keep Vandenberg apprised of every single thing they were doing and got his input on every single thing that they were doing, he also made sure that his staff members at the end of the day would get in their car and they would drive from the White House to Vandenberg's townhouse. And then the staff members would sit around and have drinks with Vandenberg at night and update him with everything that had been happening. And I'll tell you what, there's no substitution for hard work. At the end of the day, he got Vandenberg's vote. He got the majority of Republicans' votes. And Harry Truman even got Robert Taft, as you know, Mr. Republican, and just an avowed isolationist for decades, got Taft to vote with him too.
Now, this is a huge thing, right? I mean, I think Republicans had control of both houses of Congress at this point.
They had. It was and making matters worse for Harry Truman was the fact that Republicans had not controlled the House and the United States Senate in 14 years since Herbert Hoover was president. And so for Harry, Democrats had a calamitous off-year election in 1946. And so they were just taking power, Republicans, for the first time in 14 years in January of 47. And, as you know, FDR did not rule with a soft touch. He did not engage Republicans. He demonized Republicans for most of his presidency. So the last thing the rank and file Republicans in the Senate or the House wanted to do was carry the water for a Democratic president, for yet another Democratic president. They were in charge. They had campaigned on isolationism. They had promised to spend less money domestically. And the last thing they wanted was to go along with the Democratic president's plan to actually guarantee freedom for Central and Western Europe, not only through the Truman Doctrine, but also through the Marshall Plan and through NATO. But that's exactly what they did. And I think the way Harry Truman got him to do it was he convinced him it wasn't about helping a Democratic president. It wasn't even about helping America. It was about helping Europe and our allies there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Arthur Vandenberg, who had been an isolationist. He was a powerful Republican senator from Michigan, but Truman convinced him, and Truman and had other experts convince him of the domino theory. And Vandenberg told Truman that he had to address Congress and scare the hell out of the American people. Talk about that speech that Truman gave.
Well, it's interesting. Vandenberg went, you talk about the passion of the recently converted. Arthur Vandenberg went from an avowed isolationist to actually pushing Truman to say that the Truman Doctrine was more than just guaranteeing freedom in Greece and Turkey, that the Truman Doctrine was about guaranteeing freedom across Europe and the world, that we would fight against the scourge of Soviet communism wherever free people were threatened. There's an interesting moment when Dean Acheson, who was really the architect of the Truman Doctrine and one of the great diplomatic minds in American history throughout the 20th century, Acheson went up and he was given specific orders to try to limit the doctrine to Greece and Turkey. So not to scare isolationist Republicans. It was actually Vandenberg in the hearings that kept drawing Acheson out and basically said, hey, wait a second. This can't just be about Greece and Turkey because all of Europe, all of the world is threatened by Soviet communism. You have to be more aggressive. This has to be more expansive. This has to be, in effect, what George Kennan had talked about in his long telegram about an international policy of containment. And while Truman didn't say that in his speech, and while the words Soviet Union weren't even mentioned in Truman's address to Congress, everybody knew exactly what he was talking about, and they knew what they would be voting for, and that would be a policy of containment to stop Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union from expanding into Central and Western Europe.
Now, it's interesting because, Vandenberg is sort of like the first Republican to embrace being a Cold Warrior. And then, as time goes on, you've got like John F. Kennedy, like a Cold Warrior, but you've also got like the rise of Nixon and Joseph McCarthy, and eventually Republicans kind of out Cold War Democrats, right? You get to Reagan. And this brings me like where we started, like you and I, when we became conservatives, it was under like a paradigm where the Cold War was the existential threat. And that was one of the real reasons that we became conservatives. And just in the past 4 years, like that has kind of been, well, I mean, obviously when the Cold War ended, things changed, but Trump really, I think, kind of took away the framework for why people like you and I would be Republicans.
Well, it's really interesting, and it's hard for people to grasp this now if they were too young to remember what it was like during the Cold War. But yeah, maybe we were defined. My family was defined. My conservatism was defined by being a Cold Warrior and standing up to Russia wherever Russia was trying to expand its reach and its power and expand communism. And also small government at home, supporting small government at home. And for me, for you, I think for a lot of conservatives that lived through that time at least, actually pushing back on Russia internationally and pushing back on big government at home was a consistent philosophy, a consistent ideology. And there was a belief that that centralized states took away from individual freedoms, from individual rights. And that's what I've believed. And I know that's what you've believed. But things have changed pretty dramatically over the past 4 years, where a lot of our Democratic allies that helped us win the Cold War, a lot of our Democratic allies that have been our most steadfast friends over the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years have been those that have been treated the worst over the past 4 years. So it's going to be nice, I think, for the United States and even for Republicans in the United States Senate and the House to start openly showing the signs of respect and love and admiration for our allies across Europe and the world. That's something that's been missing for the past 4 years.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the speech that Tony Blinken gave. I think it
Oh
was
my
last week.
gosh.
You know, this is he's going to be Biden's Secretary of State. And he talked about his stepfather who had survived the Holocaust, and he saw a tank, but it didn't have the swastika. It had a star on it, a 5-pointed star. And he says his stepfather rushed toward it, and there was an African-American GI in it who stared down at him, and he got on his knees. And he said the only 3 words he knew in English, "God bless America." That could have been a speech. I mean, aside from the personal aspect of it, Ronald Reagan could have said that, right? Those are like Republican values that we grew up with.
Well, I'll tell you, it's something that it was so wonderful to hear a Secretary of State say that after the past 4 years. I teared up, especially when he said, "That is what we are about. That is who we are." It's why when I watch Band of Brothers, I would tear up, and I've always taken such great pride in this country and taken great pride in the fact that we really have been, I believe, we have been a city shining brightly on the hill for all the world to see. We have been the last best hope for a dying world. I'm enough of a sucker to still believe that America is the indispensable nation, and to still believe that when we help our allies, it ends up helping us. You look at everything that Harry Truman did with the Truman Doctrine, with NATO, with the Marshall Plan. The United States of America, yes, we were gracious to war-torn nations. We were supportive of our European allies, but we have been paid back, not tenfold, but hundreds of folds, thousands of folds. I mean, the American century was created by Harry Truman when he created an international framework that guaranteed there would be free countries and free markets across the globe that the United States could enter into alliances with, and yes, trade with economically. And it made all the difference. And I've known Donald Trump for a very long time. And even before he was president, Donald always had this backwards. He thought if we ever entered into a trade agreement, if we were ever helping another country, that somehow that was making us suckers. It doesn't work that way. It hasn't worked that way. And I think bluntly, that's one of the things that he hasn't gotten. And I hope that there will be a conservative party in the future that will once again understand that freedom and free markets, free enterprise is actually the pathway forward to American expansionism economically.
Yeah, it's really a clash of worldviews. I mean, Truman was basically saying America is a very powerful country and a very blessed country. And part of our responsibility is to help shape the world and to be a force for good in the world. And by the way, it's going to be, mutually beneficial, because we don't really want to see a world where, appeasement, just like we got done fighting the Germans, right? Where appeasement leads to the Soviets taking more and more control. I do want to ask you, though, largely about the Cold War, right? So some people say, well, Stalin was never going to go into Greece anyway. And you look at things like Vietnam, which sort of turned into a quagmire and caused all sorts of like societal upheaval in America. Was it, was it worth it? Like, did we have to fight this Cold War? Was there really is the domino theory, like, was that actually a thing?
Well, yeah, it was a thing. Obviously, there were obviously serious problems when it was applied too rigidly. But you look at what happened in 1947 in Greece and Turkey, and there's no doubt historically, if you look back, I think most people believed that Greece was on the verge of being toppled by communist guerrillas. And if the communists had taken over in Greece, it would have isolated Turkey and put Turkey in a terrible position where they would most likely would be next, and then Iran would fall after them. Stalin did lose interest in Greece, but he lost interest in Greece when it was obvious that the United States was moving in, and that Harry Truman and, yes, Republicans in Congress were not going to be pushed out. But yeah, there obviously there's the great tragedy of Vietnam, but this was a fight for not only the future of Western civilization. This was a fight for civilization itself. Joseph Stalin had killed 40 million of his own people. He had enslaved Eastern Europe. He wanted to enslave Central Europe and Western Europe. The Soviets continued to be focused on that until Ronald Reagan became president. And they realized after Reykjavik that was never going to happen. So I know a lot of people can look back, and maybe progressive historians can look back and try to paint an alternative ending to the Cold War that would have suggested that that the Soviets would have laid down their arms and made peace with us without the confrontation. But that's just not the case. We won the Cold War. We won the long twilight struggle against the Soviets because you had 9 presidents from Harry Truman to George H.W. Bush in both parties, continuing a singular policy of containment with slight variations, with confrontation and then détente and then confrontation again under Ronald Reagan. But for the most part, you had 9 administrations from 1945 or 1947 through 1991 who stayed focused on the same goal, and that was to contain the Soviet threat, and then when Reagan became president of the United States, to end the Soviet threat. And that's exactly what Republicans and Democrats alike accomplished over those years.
So you mentioned earlier Henry Wallace, who had been the vice president before Truman, and then you mentioned how FDR didn't bother to tell Truman about the atomic bomb. There's this quote: "God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America." Just think of I don't want to say luck, but the providence that we ended up with Harry Truman and not Henry Wallace. That could have happened. I mean, if FDR had just died a couple years earlier, that could have happened. And what would that have been like?
When you talk about an alternative history that's hard to imagine, Henry Wallace was a useful idiot for the Soviet Union. He was sympathetic to the Soviet cause. He was sympathetic to Stalin. When Harry Truman in 1947 tried to start his containment policy, tried to pass the Truman Doctrine, Henry Wallace went to Great Britain, went on foreign soil, and campaigned aggressively against Harry Truman, campaigned aggressively against the Truman Doctrine, and said it was much ado about nothing. Henry Wallace was beyond a progressive. The world that we know today would not have existed if Wallace had replaced FDR, because chances are very good that the Soviet Union would have controlled Central Europe and a great bit of Western Europe, because Wallace thought that Europe should be left to its own devices, and if that meant the Soviets swept through all of Germany, swept through France, swept into Britain, then so be it. So there was an understanding, though, by some at the time that Henry Wallace being president of the United States would be disastrous. In fact, one Democrat who worked behind the scenes to undermine Wallace's candidacy, because Wallace did not want to would go quietly into that dark night. He said that it could be written on his tombstone, "Here lies the man that stopped Henry Wallace from being president of the United States."
Something else said about Harry Truman was, "You more than any other man have saved Western civilization." That's Winston Churchill, the man of the 20th century. And and it was also, Harry Truman who wrote a personal note at the bottom of an invitation for Winston Churchill to speak at a college in Missouri that led to the famous Iron Curtain speech.
Yeah, so Harry Truman was the Rodney Dangerfield of presidents, it seemed at the time. He didn't get any respect. Again, he was called a rube by the New York Times, a mousy little man from Missouri by Time magazine. He was even members of his own party mocked him when he ran for re-election in 1948 with signs that said,
"To err is Truman."
Well, there was to err with Truman, but also "I'm just mild about Harry," which was a takeoff on a popular song at the time. "I'm just wild about Harry." Even his own mother-in-law told him he wasn't good enough to be married to Bess. And even after Harry Truman allowed his mother-in-law to live with him in the White House and remain sweet to the woman.
What do you have to do? What do you have to do to impress your mother-in-law?
She still let Harry Truman know he wasn't up to being president of the United States, even when he was letting her live there. But you know what? You can take that, and you can take the 22% approval rating that he had when he got back on the train and made that lonely trip back to Independence, Missouri. And you can put that all on one side. And then on the other side, you can have Winston Churchill saying that you, more than anybody else, saved Western civilization. And Matt, knowing that you respect Winston Churchill the way I do, I would take Winston Churchill's praise over all of that criticism, along with all that criticism, any day of the week, because Churchill obviously was a man who saved Western civilization in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. And my God, what an extraordinary honor to have that man recognize that Harry Truman did the same when he stood up to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union after World War II.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of these names earlier: George Marshall, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Averell Harriman. Just talk, if you would, a little bit about the team and the players that helped Harry Truman
Yeah.
pull off this really difficult challenge.
Matt, one of the things that what people have asked why I wrote the book, part of it has to do with my admiration for Harry Truman, but also I have great admiration for the wise men that were around him at the time. And we have gotten in over the past 20, 30 years, we've gotten this populist streak Americans have, that it's great to have outsiders. It's great to have people in the White House who really don't know Washington, really don't like Washington, aren't creatures of Washington, aren't part of. Okay, that's actually the sort of thinking that has put us where we've been, because it's not popular for me to say it. I'm going to say it though. We've had 3 presidents now in the 21st century that really didn't like Washington, D.C., that really didn't like their job. 2 of them, they did their jobs, and then they'd go upstairs and watch ESPN. And then we've got a 3rd. My God, I wish he would have just worked until 6 o'clock and gone upstairs and watched ESPN. But you really have to wonder why Americans want outsiders so badly.
Let me stop you there. Jimmy Carter's one, right?
Jimmy Carter was an outsider, right?
Who else you got?
Oh, well, I was just saying this century. You have Donald Trump, and then you have Barack Obama, who, if you talk to people who worked with Barack Obama, he and Michelle didn't really like Washington. They didn't really like the job. They were glad to get out of town. They didn't want to get out of town with Donald Trump being president of the United States. And then you had George W. Bush, who also, again, he wanted to be president, but he really didn't like Washington that much.
I see. So you're saying the last 3 presidents said that.
I'm saying the last 3 presidents, and that has consequences. Here, we've got a guy who's been in Washington since 1974, I think. I mean, since he was 29 years old. I'm looking forward to seeing what Joe Biden can do, looking forward to see what a little bit of experience can do. And it's the same thing with Harry Truman. Truman was a creature of Washington. So he knew how to work with Republicans. He knew how to work with Democrats. He knew how to bring people together. And he surrounded himself with the most gifted political minds of his time, people who had dedicated their lives to public service. You had General George Marshall, who was his first Secretary of State, he was the organizer of the Allies' victory in World War II. You have Dean Acheson, considered one of the great minds of the 20th century, who was the architect of the Truman Doctrine. You have Averell Harriman, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union and knew the Soviet Union and Russia so well because, first time he visited there was in 1899 when Nicholas II was czar. And he kept around. And then, of course, you had George Kennan, who wrote the long telegram, who first warned of the need to contain Soviet expansion and to check Soviet aggression. So Harry Truman surrounded himself with people who worked in Washington, who believed in public service, and who were dedicated to public service. And when he needed that expertise the most, he got it. And I guess, I don't want to go to a dentist, let alone a brain surgeon, who says, I really don't like what I do. I really don't. You know what? I don't like medical school. I'm just, I'm an outsider. It doesn't make sense. Like, to quote George W. Bush from his first failed presidential debate in 2004, it's hard. It's hard. Well, it is hard. Making Washington work is hard. And you look at the people who've been successful doing it. Ronald Reagan, who was a successful 2-term governor of California, who understood how to work with legislatures. Bill Clinton was successful legislatively. He knew how to work with Republicans because he had been governor for 12 years in Arkansas and had to deal with conservatives in Arkansas. I always joke that you could impeach Bill Clinton on Tuesday, and on Wednesday he'd call you up and go, "Hey, you want to go golfing?" The guy always knew there was another vote coming. There was another reason to stay engaged. And that's the sort of leadership on both sides of the aisle that I think we need a lot more of, that Harry Truman exhibited and that his aides exhibited as well.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan and Clinton both ran as outsiders, but they had experience and they didn't have a chip on their shoulders about being an outsider, right? They came to Washington and they got to know folks and how things were done here, and they hired top-notch professionals and
No.
people who had been around, and so they ran as outsiders, but they didn't kind of do the anti-intellectual, anti-expert thing.
No, and you know what? They love the job, and they actually threw themselves headfirst into their job and threw themselves headfirst into Washington, D.C. Of course, most famously, Ronald and Nancy Reagan were friends with Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. Bill Clinton, you couldn't keep him inside the White House. The guy was always out. He was constantly working the phones. He was constantly getting together with the Republicans. I remember hearing stories. Mika's told me stories about her father when he was national security advisor. Mika said she grew up with Republicans instead of Democrats because her father would work at the White House, and when he socialized, he'd invite Republicans over to the Brzezinski household because those were the people that he had to get to know, that he had to understand, that he had to compromise with, and that's an art form that we forgot. And you talked about the quote that was attributed to Bismarck about fools. There's a special divine providence for fools, drunkards in the United States of America. Another quote that has been attributed to Bismarck is that politics is the art of the possible. And that's, I think, what we've forgotten, where we've had presidents that try to get what they want, and when they don't get it, they sign an executive order and move on to the next topic. Let's hope that starts changing again, not just with this president, but with the presidents that follow.
I read a few years ago a book by John O'Sullivan called "The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister." And I didn't know this, but apparently the Russians believed that your father-in-law was planted by the Pope to topple the Soviet Union. There was something that came out in some of their files years later. I don't know if you'd ever heard about that.
That is so funny. No, I had not. I need to read that book because I'd enjoy it.
I think I'm right. It's been about a decade since I read it, but I think that was in there.
Well, the Russians had little use for Dr. Brzezinski. I will say they showed admirable restraint when he died, and were actually grudgingly respectful of him, and I certainly appreciated that. But no, Dr. Brzezinski told me some pretty remarkable stories, and it's something that I never knew because we always associate him with the Carter administration. But Ronald Reagan actually asked Dr. Brzezinski to be his national security advisor, and he told him that out of respect for Jimmy Carter, he couldn't do it because it had been an especially tough campaign for the Carters. And he said, I owe my position in Washington to Jimmy Carter, but I will help you any way I can. And he was in the Reagan White House a good deal and helped throughout the Reagan administration because he was driven as a guy who escaped Hitler's Poland, a guy whose father was a diplomat in Germany, and I believe in 33 and 34 during the rise of Hitler, and then worked in the Soviet Union in 35, 36 during the purges, Stalin's purges. You're talking about getting the bad gigs. Dr. Brzezinski's father and the Brzezinskis were there and had firsthand knowledge of the evils of totalitarianism and fled to Canada. And he spent his entire life as a Cold Warrior. And he told me one of my favorite stories that he told was when he went in, he talked to Reagan's CIA director, Bob Casey. And he let him know. He said, there's an underground group in Poland, and they need a printing press, and they're doing good work, but they're running out of money. And Bob Casey mumbled something about Dr. Brzezinski coming back the next day. He said, Dr. Brzezinski said, so I go on the next day, I walk into his office, I sit down, and he hands me a briefcase. I open the briefcase, and there's $50,000 cash in it. He says, what am I supposed to do with this? And he said, close it, leave, and get it to your people. And I was like, wow. Okay.
Charlie Wilson's War.
Yeah, Charlie Wilson's War. But I think also, those sort of stories and hearing what Dr. Brzezinski did behind the scenes with Republican presidents, with Democratic presidents, and hearing what a lot of good Democrats did behind the scenes with Republican presidents, and a lot of Republicans, what they did behind the scenes with good Democratic presidents. I think that's really, there's a lot we can learn from Truman. But I think looking at the Cold War in general, there's a lot that we can learn in 2020 about what bipartisan foreign policy means to this country, that Republicans and Democrats can work together. And when they do work together, extraordinary things can happen. And I remain very hopeful, maybe too hopeful. I don't know. I just think we've done it before, and the United States can do it again.
Amen, brother. Well, let's stop on a hopeful note. But I also, before I let you go, Joe, I just want to say thank you publicly for being a great friend to me over the years. It means a lot, and you and Mika. So thank you for that.
Well, I thank you so much for being such a good friend too. I also. I don't want to get too political here, but I will just say that the past several years at times have been difficult for me. I've spent my entire adult life in this as an evangelical in the Southern Baptist Church, as a small government conservative, fighting for the things that have meant so much to me my entire adult life. And over the past 4 years, it's been rewarding to see friends who have kept their eyes fixed on the North Star, and you've been one of them. And that's just meant the world to me, Matt. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And let me just say to our listeners out there, if we want to get the top-notch guests, the Joe Scarboroughs of the world, we have to buy the books. And this one, by the way, Christmas is coming up. This would be an awesome Christmas gift. Buy it for yourself. Buy a copy for a loved one. It's called Saving Freedom, Truman, the Cold War, and the Fight for Western Civilization. Joe Scarborough, thank you for coming on the news.
Thank you so much, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.